Hello, my name is Tate Hieronymus. Welcome to the Bluff Creek Project Podcast. I am here with my co-hosts today, multiple hosts coing together. Robert Leiterman and Jonathan Easley. What's up, guys?
Hi, it's Jonathan.
That was fast.
Hi, it's Robert.
What's up, guys? So we were doing something pretty fun. It's three interviewers and one interviewee. And why are we interviewing this guy? Do any of you have the answer to why?
No, you just said you called us up and says, "Hey, you got some free time? We're gonna have this interview and stuff." And there's this guy named Dustin Severs. We're like, "Who's that guy?" Well, he says, "We just got a new book out. We got to interview this guy."
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Dustin Severs. He wrote a really good book. It's called The Abominable Snowman of California. And you know what? Without further ado, let's just bring Dustin on. What's up, Dustin?
Hello, fellas. Good evening.
Now, I always describe to myself, at least, Dustin as the quiet member of the Bluff Creek Project. I mean, would you say that's fair, Dustin, or nah?
Depends on the circumstances. I can be quite chatty at times. Usually, when we're sitting around the campfire, Jamie Wayne, he does all the talking, so no one can get a word in.
Well, yeah, that's true. Well, this past summer was Steven at the campfire this time, and
Steven Struford?
yeah, we got Steven Strufert back up to the Bluff Creek area. He was at the cell site with us for a couple nights.
Really? In the 7 years I've been going up there, I've never seen him
Yep.
near the Bluff Creek watershed. So yeah,
It was as historical as Roger and Bob filming Patty.
that is a historic moment.
In 67. And it was in the same place too, so it's pretty awesome. But enough about that. But so you decided to write a book, and you kind of been starting this project for a long time, going on, like, I don't know how many years. How many years has it been?
It's been 6 years, so it kind of coincided with me moving out here and meeting the Bluff Creek Project guys. So I can kind of give you a quick background. So I'm originally from the Midwest. I'm 44, and in March of 2016, I moved to the Great Pacific Northwest. I landed here in Ashland, Oregon, which is about 10 miles north of the California border. And actually, my house sits on the foothills of the Klamath Mountains, which are the same mountains which contain Bluff Creek. So my house is about 70 miles northeast of Bluff Creek as the crow flies. It takes quite a drive to get there. So again, I moved here in 2016, and I mean, I think the second day I was here, a friend came out with me, and we detached my car from my U-Haul, and we immediately drove out to the West Coast as I wanted to head for Bluff Creek. So it was my first trip out here. We jumped on 101, headed south, went through the redwoods, saw the redwoods for the first time, went through Eureka, and then we jumped on Highway 299, went over the hill, and then we dropped into the gateway of Bigfoot country, which is Willow Creek. And from there, I did what any smart researcher would do. I headed to Bigfoot books, and I talked to the gatekeeper of Bigfoot country in Willow Creek, which is Steven Struford. And it was an interesting meeting. So he was there at the bookstore, and Jamie Wayne was there as well. And there's also a third person who was there. I'm not going to mention that person's name. That's a different story. So I was a greenhorn at the time. I knew who Steven was. So I watched the movie Willow Creek, which I love the movie. And of course, Robert played a big role in that movie. Even though you don't see his mug throughout the movie, just hear his voice or his yells. So I knew who Steven was, and so yeah, him and Jamie were great. So I was a greenhorn at the time. So I said, "Hey, I want to go up to Bluff Creek." And it was March of 2016. I didn't realize you know it was snowed in at that time. So Jamie provided me with a map, which I still have to this day, which is laminated. So before heading up or attempting to go up to Bluff Creek, we went up the Go Road. We got, I don't know, 7, 8 miles, and we ran into ice. So we headed back home. But before I left the bookstore, Steven told me about your guys' annual Bigfoot campout every July. So fast forward to July, I come to the campout and I meet Bob Hieronymus's great nephew, Tate.
No relation.
Also, I meet this unusual forest ranger turned Bigfooter named Robert Leiterman. I met Rowdy Kelly, and of course Stephen wasn't up there, but I saw him on different occasions. So yeah, I became hooked right away. So ever since that time, I guess that was the summer of 2016, I've been coming up every summer. I usually come up 2-3 times a year. So I usually come up in October, and I come up in the summer, probably some other time. And usually the gatekeepers up there, the guys that really know every valley, every creek, is Robert and Rowdy. So I just kind of follow those guys' lead. They let me tag along. Again, I've been doing that for 7 years now. And that's what really kind of got me interested in this subject. I've always been interested in Bigfoot, obviously. That's why I headed to Bluff Creek. And I love history. That's really my jam, I guess, as far as history books. I'm particularly interested in origin stories. And if I go to a new area, I always ask myself, how did this all start? Who were the people who got it going? So those are kind of the questions I had about the Bluff Creek Bigfoot. So I was already familiar with the Patterson-Gimlin film, obviously. I kind of knew the basics of Jerry Crew's cast in '58. So being the bookaholic that I am, I immediately, got on Amazon and started ordering every book I could find about Bigfoot history. And I was kind of surprised at what I did not find. So of course, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of books about examining, Bigfoot. Generally, there's only a select few to actually focus on the history of Bigfoot and Bluff Creek and get that origin story and focus on the cast of characters, the personalities that were involved. And there's some good ones. There's a few good ones, just namely Joshua Booth has a good book called Bigfoot. And then Michael McLeod has a good book called The Anatomy of the Beast. I particularly enjoyed those two. And Greg Long, albeit a controversial book, is a good book. Has a lot of great information in there. So those are probably the three that were the most influential to me. But they didn't really give a deep dive. They kind of gave an overview of the characters and the stories. I was really shocked, and no one had given a definitive, comprehensive history of the origin story of Bigfoot. I was like, man, that'd be great if a great writer such as David Grant or whatever great historical writer of today would really take on that task of really researching the subject and writing a book. I said, hey, why don't I give it a try? So 6 years later, I finally got this darn book published. So originally my intent was to focus on the Patterson-Gimlin film. And after a couple of years, I realized that's just too large of a book. So ultimately I ended up splitting it in two. So ultimately I'm looking to cover the 1958 to 1979 period. And I ended up splitting it down the middle. So the first book, I focused on the 1958 to 1967 period, which what I refer to in the book as a classic period. And this is the time before the Patterson-Gimlin film, and it really focuses on what was originally the iconography of the Bigfoot legend, which these inexplicable giant footprints. And I kind of focus on that original cast of characters. And that's my intent for the second book, which I hope to have out this fall, is to pick up and cover that 1967 to 1979 period, which is really all about the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Man, that's so much history in one book. And like when you were like trying to figure out what to write about, what historical event in the Bluff Creek, area were you most excited to kind of cover in the book?
I say the seminal events and that I cover in the book is one is that fall of 1958 when so Jerry Crew brought the plaster cast to the Humboldt Times and the story was put out on Sunday, October 5th, 1958. And then that's really when Bigfoot mania ensued for the first time. So part one of the book covers just that unforgettable fall season of 1958. And then the other two major events during this classic period would be what I cover in part 3, which is the Tom Slick expedition. So this was from the fall of 1959 to the fall of 1962, when Tom Slick tragically was killed in an airplane accident in Montana. And there's actually two expeditions that took place. Initially, there was a expedition in Bluff Creek called the Pacific Northwest Expedition. And then a year later, he added a second expedition in the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia, and that was headed up by Bob Titmus, and he was occasionally joined by John Green. John Green couldn't commit full time. He ran a newspaper. He had 5 kids. And meanwhile, down in the Pacific Northwest, that was spearheaded by the Byrne brothers, who John Green and Bob Titmus despised, and along with Peter Byrne was also with his brother Brian, and there's a few other people. Jerry Carew was actually involved in the Pacific Northwest expedition, along with his nephew Jim Crews, who's still alive today, and who actually was able to interview a bit for the book. And then the final part of the book, the last real watershed moment in Bigfoot history during this classic period, is the big year of 1967. And so I cover that up to obviously the major event that occurred there, which is October 20th, or allegedly October 20th, 1967. That's the Patterson-Gimlin film. So the part 4 leads up to that moment. So I cover John Green and Renee DeHenden's kind of tour that winter throughout Northern California, kind of reuniting some of their old contacts. So they went through what they called the quiet years from 1962 to 1967, where when a lot of activity going on after the death of Tom Slick. So things really got going again in 1967. And in part 4, I really focus on the summer of 1967, which is when they found the tracks on Blue Creek Mountain, which would ultimately bring Patterson-Gimlin to Bluff Creek later that fall. And we, of course, know what happened then.
Now I know Jonathan had some questions about the P&W expedition that you kind of mentioned to me before a little bit, talking about that, Jonathan.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's been like years, and so I want to say I've been reading Dustin's book. I'm way past halfway, certainly, and so what I took away from this so far is that when I first got into this subject, I started to kind of learning the origin stories, not because they're the origin stories, but it was so interesting because all these guys, it was very humanizing, all these guys were actually out there working, in construction and doing all this stuff. They weren't researchers or even into Bigfoot. And you had all this big group of people that discovered all this stuff. And it's kind of funny because it's really hard to find information on these people and what happened. And, it's 1967 and the Patty film and everything. It's like everybody knows what that is, but nobody knows the stories behind it. No one knows the people and, why it became so big, why Patterson drove all the way up from Washington, and why this place in particular is such a big deal. This book, is the only book that by far just humanizes all of that stuff. In other words, you start to read these stories and you realize, these people aren't any different from us today. They're probably way cooler, way better people, right? A lot more rugged, certainly, being some of the few people up there. And, they all had families and they all had just regular lives, and they come across things like giant footprints and the rumors of giant footprints and working around, these things that keep happening. And, there's reporters and newspapers. And I just wanted to say that this book puts all of that into this awesome story. It tells it like a story. And, so I guess what I'm kind of rambling onto, Dustin, is how on earth did you get all of this information that's scattered all over the internet, different books, different people, like word of mouth? It must have been such an incredible journey in gathering all this information to put into this book. How was that journey? You said 6 years, right?
Yeah, it was extremely challenging. So it was really just a huge jigsaw puzzle I was trying to put together. So I would constantly have little gaps in the storyline, and it go on for months, and I just have a breakthrough where I would really discover something that really closed that gap. So it was tremendous challenge. So it's between most of my information comes from newspaper articles. I got a lot of letters are always the most precious thing for any historian. Those are the most intimate things you can find. So I got thousands of letters between, from Bob Titmus and John Green, Renee DeHinden. So I say those are what I hold the most dear are those letters. And yeah, it was quite a challenge, and it continues to be. Like I said, I'm about 7% done with the second book. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. It could be frustrating at times. I say the research, putting the puzzle together is really the fun part, sitting down and writing, and that's when it really becomes a nightmare, and you tend to hate it after a while. But yeah, it's definitely fulfilling to finally finish that first book. I should just mention real quick, when I say the origin, I have to be careful when I say the origin stories. I may offend some people. When I say the origin story, when my book is kind of a pop history of the Bigfoot legend, it kind of focuses on the cast of characters involved in the Bigfoot. So it's not, of course, if you are a believer in Bigfoot, obviously Bigfoot did not begin in October of 1958. But again, my focus in this book was to look through the lens of a pop history historian, and it's really focused on the individuals involved. So it's not really an analysis of whether or not Bigfoot exists. I'll leave that internal task to others. There's been hundreds of books about that. So like I always say, Bigfoot may not be real, but guys like John Green, Renee DeHinden, and Peter Byrne, they were absolutely real. And it's a pleasure to write about the guys, because what makes any great story great is to have great characters to write about. And that's what I find the most intriguing about the Bigfoot stories, is such awesome, diverse characters. You can ask for better characters to write about than guys like Ivan Sanderson and Renee DeHinden, just really interesting people.
Well, it's like you said earlier, there's not a lot of books about the character, the people involved back in the days. There's a bunch of books about like, Bigfoot in California and stuff like that. But, I don't think until today, there's been a book like yours that's talked about the people, which is super cool, because it's important to know about the people and about the subject and kind of the history of the area. So I think your book's going to coincide really nicely with a bunch of other books too. They're like, it's going to go down in history, in my opinion, with some great books out there already.
I hope so.
It seemed really hard to put all this into a book, because the personalities were huge. Ray Wallace and, Jerry Crew. Like, you just can't stop kind of reading about these people. These were like really kind of low key but fascinating guys, right? So was there like are there certain characters that you find yourself either admiring or just like being really into? Like, was there somebody that just drew you in more than another one?
I say my favorite in terms of being the most colorful, the one that really brings a smile to my face to read and learn about is Renee DeHinden. You can ask for a more colorful character than that guy. And I learned he's more of a complex character than what he portrays on the surface. The most interesting character, the one that required the most research, is definitely Ivan Sanderson. That guy lived an amazing life. I can't believe no one has ever written a book about him. So I have a pretty large biography of him in the book, perhaps too long, but I really struggled to shorten it down to what I did, because the guy lived such a fascinating subject. So I hope I didn't get off the main storyline too much, but it was just impossible not to write about that guy's the amazing life that he had. And finally, I said the character I respect the most is without a doubt John Green. He was just a really thoughtful, intelligent guy. He had a lot of integrity. So I definitely I admire a lot of these guys, and they're all flawed individuals. But in terms of having the least number of flaws, that I would definitely have to assign that to John Green. All great characters. Even Ray Wallace, I think he wasn't a bad guy. He was a family man. He had a big heart. Did a lot for the community, a lot for children. He was a successful businessman somehow. He was a really, really goofy guy.
It sounds like Robert Leiterman.
They mean that part about being a really goofy guy, or the part about the family.
A little bit of both.
All the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah. I guess sometimes it's hard for me to sit here and not say anything. I was like, oh, I want to say this, I want to say that. So, can I say something now?
Robert, of course, you just jump in.
All right. Yeah, I don't like to step on people's feet and everything. Well, this day is long in coming. I mean, we tried so hard to get Dustin to do a podcast interview. He's like,
how many years, Robert?
I don't know.
Like
I don't know. Well, we almost got him one time, and he no, we're not going to do it. No, I think the closest we got to getting. I know I'm digressing, but this is all building up to the climax here. So, the closest we got him at first was we were at the film site, and I finally got him to start talking. And I'm recording this. We're going on for 15 minutes, and Dustin he's a wealth of knowledge, and it's just like he's got this information, and it's flowing. I'm there with Kip. You remember that, Dustin?
Mm-hmm.
We're at the film site. You were there with Kip, myself, and here goes Leiterman. He's got his little digital recorder out there, and he's recording. So about 15 minutes later, I check in and stop recording 5 minutes in. So it was like a failure. And then we went over to Kip Camp, and then we sat around. It was a beautiful night. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you kept throwing sticks to the fire. It kept popping. I had to delete that out later, but that's a different story there. But he opened up a little bit, and we finally got a chance to see the Dustin there, the guy with all the knowledge coming out. That was good. But we've been looking forward to this. And Dustin says, I will give you guys the interview after I finish my book. It's like, we've been waiting for this moment, and here it is today. Well,
Robert and I, we're placing bets behind your back whether you're not going to finish the book or not.
No, we were.
I kept saying, next year. I got to be done next year. That's why I kept telling you guys. Yeah. I generally believe that. I was wrong.
Well, we talked before about
it's a pretty hefty book too. This is not a short book by any means. It's just like this. I think it's an inheritance here. That's if you're part of the Bluff Creek Project, your book that you write looks like this. It's, for those of you that can't see, I'm holding something that resembles the Bible.
It's almost thicker than Robert's book.
But both are just loaded with awesome information. So it's not like you get bored of them or anything like that.
But Robert, well, I mean, like, what do you have more to say on this whole thing too?
But the book thing?
Yeah.
Well, I like what you did with it, Dustin, because you read a lot of books and they throw a bunch of facts at you. And after a while, how many facts can you read about the same activity over and over again? Everybody has, they put their own little pictures on everything. But what you've done here is pretty cool. I'm a fiction writer mostly, but I do like to do factual stuff. But what you've done is you went ahead and you take all this factual information. I've gone with you to the library at least once or twice, researching stuff. So I know you spent hours in libraries doing all this research, collecting this information. And then you take all this information and you're going, how am I going to deliver this? And you did a great job. You put it in dialogue. And now people can read and learn, and it flows with the dialogue. And I know you talked before about, the Ivan section. It is big and it's substantial. And there's a lot going on in this guy's life. And I read only a little bit about Mr. Sanderson, but I tell you, that guy's been busy. And having you do the background on it and bring it all together, he's a big character in it. And I think he's an influential character. And I think you're spending the time on him is worthy.
Yeah, and he continues, but he's probably even a larger character in the second book. So that's what's interesting about this period, the period that I write about in these two books, is the same cast of characters in both books. We have a few new ones added in the second book, but essentially it's still the same fraternity of guys.
Now I got a question. In the second book, do you ever talk about, because it's kind of about the players. I mean, and would that include people like Bob Hieronymus or Philip Morris that came in later and talking about how they were a part of the film that Roger and Bob filmed too?
Yeah, so the second book's structure almost identical to the first book. So the first book, it covers what I call that classic period from 58 to 67. It focuses on the footprints and then the potential of Ray Wallace being the spoiler. The second book covers 67 to 79. and it focuses not on footprints, but what kind of come to supplant the footprints as kind of the crown jewel of Bigfoot evidence. That is the Patterson-Gimlin film. And then I also bring in Bob Hieronymus as the possible spoiler. So again, they're structured very similar. So I end up working out pretty well, splitting the two books. And to point out is it's not a two-part book. They're both standalone books. They have a full narrative arc with a resolution at the end. The second book basically just picks up right where part 4 leaves off, which is at the end of the fiasco that occurred up on Blue Creek Mountain in the summer of '67.
Yeah, Dustin,
Sorry, go ahead, Robert. No, you go ahead.
Okay. Hey, Dustin, you traveled to a lot of these locations you're talking about. I remember you've been to Canada. You went up to Green's Country up there, and you visited some of these historical places where activities took place. You want to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think that's what drives the idea I have for my third book is a historic event that occurred here in Ashland back in 1923. So I think I'm attracted to write about places I can physically go and experience and see. So of course I know I've been to Bluff Creek scores of time now. I also went to Harrison. I went to British Columbia a few years ago, and just like I did the same thing I did when I went to Willow Creek. When I got into Harrison Hot Spring, I got the gatekeeper of Sasquatch country, which is Thomas Stingberg, and he took me to all the historic places. He took me to the Chapman's house where the Ruby Creek incident occurred. He also took me to the location where the Jocko sighting occurred. So one place I did not go, I did not make it to I would love to go to the Himalaya, but I did not make it to the Himalaya, and also I've been planning to go to the Great Bear Rainforest. It's like literally number 1 on my list. So I really want to go to the Great Bear Rainforest, which is where the British Columbia expedition took place. That I write pretty extensively about.
I got a question. Okay, the Ruby Creek incident place. I mean, what's that place look like? Does it look squatchy, if you have to use that term? Is it a good area, or is it kind of more open? Is there a lot of?
It's open, but it butts Squatchy area. So it butts the Fraser River and the railroad line, the Pacific Canadian Pacific Railroad. But directly behind where the home was is a very mountainous area.
Because I'm telling you, like, there's a lot of old cool stories. You got obviously the Patterson-Gimlin film. You got Ape Canyon, but outside the PG film, I think Ruby Creek is one of my favorite incidents regarding Bigfoot. So I just had to say that.
Yeah, no, that's one of the legendary tales, and it's mostly due to the work of Rene DeHinden and John Green back in the 1950s. So they uncovered the Ruby Creek incident. You had the Albert Otzman kidnapping, the William Rowe sighting, and then the Jocko that occurred back in I believe in 1884. I believe it allegedly went down. So there's all uncovered by Lanky and Cranky.
So you can't.
That's.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I just wanted to ask. You've been to all these other places, right? And you and I have been to all these places as well, and within Humboldt, and all the places you wrote about in your book, Onion Lake, Louse Camp, all the historical places in that area. Like, how does it feel to go to these places where that all these just really neat stories took place? And do you have a favorite one, and why?
Oh, Bluff Creek. Bluff Creek's the holy of holies when it comes to Bigfoot. The whole trinity of the abominable snowman of the Himalaya, Sasquatch of British Columbia, Bigfoot of Northern California. Nothing compares to Bluff Creek. Number 2 would have to be Harrison Hot Springs, the Garibaldi Park area around Harrison Lake. And you guys know me, I don't really acknowledge non-Pacific Northwest Bigfoot.
Okay, Peter Burn.
Only one I give a pass to is Boggy Creek because of the movies.
You're such a
special spot in my heart. So they get a pass.
Such a Peter Burner. Such a Peter Burner who doesn't.
I warn friends that talk to you. I go, guys, just like when you reference Bigfoot outside of Humboldt, like, you're gonna get corrected by Dustin. So
I'm gonna make it. I make it my
the Bigfoot of Bluff Creek. I was like, no, the Bigfoot. All the rest of them were just knockoffs.
Hey, you gave me a hard time from it. Bigfoot of Humboldt. It's like, well, that's an oxymoron. It's rhetorical, yeah.
I'm gonna write a book called The Bigfoot of Oklahoma, and just to irritate Dustin.
Oh, the abominable snowman of Iowa. I already gave you the title for your
Iowa, the corn man of Iowa. Do you have a favorite place within the Bluff Creek area, Dustin?
Louse Camp. Love Louse Camp. Unfortunately, Robert and Roddy never want to stay there anymore.
You never ask me. I'll stay there. I love it.
I always bitch that they never stay there. Now we're either staying at the cell tower because they can't get the RVs in the Louse Camp, or sometimes Robert wants to stay away from the crowd because we have a bunch of. We've been getting up some big crowds up there in July, so he likes to stay down by the berm. It's cool, all the places. I don't know, but nothing's more special than Louse Camp. Not only the history, but just such a beautiful spot. You got that great swimming hole in the back. So yeah, you can't beat Louse Camp.
It's I've camped in a lot of places that are famous in the Bluff Creek area. And to this day, I always say Louse Camp is the coolest and creepiest place of all I've ever camped in, and it's still my favorite. Yeah.
Well, speaking of Louse Camp, so the history of Louse Camp, it was basically constructed by the Wallace brothers when they were building the logging road up there in the late 1950s. So that's where Jerry Crew was staying at. He was actually living in a travel trailer with his nephew. That summer, he'd always travel home on the weekends. So that's where it all started, was in Louse Camp. His first tracks were found just a few miles from Louse Camp. And then, of course, Louse Camp ended up being the base camp for the Pacific Northwest expedition a few years later. It was for a few years. So, yeah, you would get more of a historic location in Louse Camp. What I think is really special about Bluff Creek is all the most historic places are all within a few mile radius of each other. So if you've never been there, you can just drive up there and you can see Louse Camp, and you can drive around the road and see Laird Meadows, and you can just drive right down the road and see the Patterson Gimlin site. So it's all right there close together. I
think it maybe take you just half of the day to do all of that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then definitely do it in a day trip. Yeah.
Either Robert or Dustin, I don't know. Do you guys know? Because obviously the P&W expedition that Slick held was at Louse Camp. I wonder if it looked the same back then as it did, before the 64 flood.
No, well, not as the damage was so much the 64 flood as it was the logging that was going up there. So going after World War II, I mean, the Bluff Creek watershed, that Klamath-Siskiyou Mountain area was really the final frontier in America. And I say America, I'm not counting Alaska because it wasn't admitted to the Union until 1959. So that was really, that was all old growth, primeval forest up there, virgin country. So it looks, when you look at aerial views today, you can still see these little patches of old growth. But yeah, it looks very different than it would have back in the 1950s. It's been decades of intensive logging that's been going on over there. And of course, the 64 flood, that kind of put a kibosh on them extending. So originally, how they got started in the 1950s is they wanted to create a logging superhighway across the mountains, starting in Highway 96 at the where Bluff Creek started, and they're all extended all the way to Highway 199 to the north, which is about 40 miles, and they're always followed the Bluff Creek in order to do it. And then finally, they had nothing but trouble because the mountains there are so steep; they're constantly plagued by landslides. So in the 64, they finally gave up on it, but eventually ended up finishing or almost completing that operation with the GO Road, which stands for Gasky Orleans. But we know the history of that, which is fascinating, and actually complete. There's like a 2-3 mile gap in between it.
The GO Road, yeah, it's such a cool story in itself.
The Lost Highway. I remember the first time I was talking about earlier when I first drove up there. I was like, why is there this really wide paved highway in the middle of this forest? I thought it was so odd, so I looked it up and I learned the story of it. And it's very interesting.
I can't remember if it was Kip this trip telling us or who it was, Robert or somebody. But I guess back then, maybe it was 2022 and somebody's telling us. No, it was 2022. It was Kip. He was saying like back then when they were building the Go Road, there was like basically a bush pilot that would land on the Go Road because there was like a long flat enough section he could do it. He was landing planes there, like dropping stuff off, I guess.
Yeah.
Kind of weird.
It's a super odd place, just super wide, really nicely paved in the absolute middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
I remember my first time on it, I was like, is this real? Yeah.
Yeah, for those that don't know the story, so they had to go deal with a lot of red tape, particularly from the native community. So ultimately, they weren't able to complete the highway, which was intended to connect Highway 96 to Highway 199 to the north, which originally was the function of Bluff Creek Road was supposed to be. So now there's like this weird, like, I don't know how big, Robert probably knows, maybe like 2-3 mile gap. So I've driven it both. I've driven from south to its terminus, and I've also driven it from the north from 199 to its terminus. So it's pretty cool.
What's the gap, Robert?
It's about 6 miles. Think of it this way: from the end of the top, I'll just say the north end, it ends at a berm, and that's where it used to be a Jeep trail. They're putting the road in on an old Jeep trail. So it ends at the berm. There's a trail you can walk that trail, which divides the wilderness. And it goes all the way down, and then it's over near Chimney Rock. It drops down towards Elk Valley Campground. So it drops down into there, and you're just following an old Jeep trail down. And then you get to the campground, and then there's a dirt road that goes around. But they were actually going to take the high ridge on the right as you're going in. They're just going to loop it around and then reconnect it there. That's how close they came to destroying the sacred high country for the.
Could you imagine
for the Iraqi group?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, like I said, no one knows the area better than Robert and Rowdy. Those guys, I just follow their lead when I go out there.
Could you imagine if they did connect those roads? Like, I don't think Bluff Creek would be as isolated as it is today.
Yeah,
I mean, it's crazy. And then, there's something else I want to ask you, Dustin, because you were on a friend of ours podcast, Bigfoot Society, Jeremiah Byron, and I feel exactly how you feel when you walk over the bridge that's like maybe a few hundred yards from Louse Camp and it says 1958 on it. It does give me goosebumps. Like, how many times do you drive over that and see that number on the bridge, the year, and just get...
Because I remember the first time I saw it, I thought it was it put chills down my spine for sure. So I was almost, I can't remember which direction I was going, but I know I was right in the epicenter. And I went across this bridge slowly and I looked down. Sure enough, in the concrete bridge, it has inscribed 1958. Yeah, that really definitely had an impact. And I still love seeing it. So creepy. And there's a lot of history behind that bridge. As we talked about it, when they were constructing that bridge, they had a lot of sightings. Apparently, there's one episode where 4 dogs were allegedly ripped in half, and that occurred while they were building that Notice Creek Bridge.
Now, that reminded me of something, because I don't know if Jonathan was with us, but I know Ron and I were at the China Flat Museum in Willow Creek, and the guy that Les Stroud interviewed about the dog being ripped and torn apart and stuff, that guy was on Jerry Crew's crew when that happened, or apparently.
I can't remember the name. So Jay Rowland, who's a prominent character in my book, he also claimed to have came across his dog ripped in half. But actually a different situation happened years later. The one I'm referring to actually occurred in October of 1958. I can't remember the guy's name. Well, I think his name was Goodwin. I'm not sure if he was on the same. I think he was like the foreman. I think they were focused on building that bridge. So I think
it was I think it was different.
Yeah. So it's probably a different.
These guys all know each other? Or?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think they only had about 30 guys on the crew that were working up in Bluff Creek in 1958. And a lot of them were the native Hoopa Kurok.
So multiple of them had dogs ripped apart according to their stories.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah. So Bigfoot was largely saw as a benign, peaceful creature, but that was one exception to the stories that fall was that particular story.
Yeah.
It's so
Now
insane.
these stories are a long time ago, but I mean, guys like Jay Rowland are still alive, right? Did you get to
No, he
talk
just
to him?
died. Jay Rowland
He
just
just
died.
passed
So
away. Oh, I'm sorry
yeah,
to hear
while I was
that,
writing
man.
the book, Jay Rowland died, Al Hodgson died,
Mhm.
Peter Byrne just died. I actually had to I
Yeah.
was almost finalized the book. I had to go back and change it real quick to update
Yeah,
that.
yeah. We were in
And
the middle of nowhere when we found out Peter burned. We were up there. Where were we at the end of the? We were
mhm.
going to Elk Valley actually when we got like a bar reception and found out he died. That's recently.
Yeah, I remember Steven Struffer were supposed to interview Jay Rowland because he was Steven's neighbor. He actually lived, even though he's originally from Arkansas, he never left. You know, he came to the northwest in the 1950s with all the logging that was going on. He stayed there till the day he died just a few years ago. He lived in Willow Creek and was always adamant that the tracks were legitimate, although he was also adamantly opposed to. He didn't believe Patterson and Gimlin's story, but yeah,
Hmm.
he said he was there. He said he looked over Jerry Crew's shoulder as Jerry Crew poured the cast into the
Wow.
track. Yeah, and I also spoke to Jim Crew, who was also alive. He was only like 19 years old back then,
Hmm.
so he's like in his early 80s now, which is cool. So he actually wasn't there. He worked on and off at Bluff Creek, but he was actually in college in October of 1958. So he wasn't there when it went down. However, the next year he joined. He was like Peter Burns' lieutenants, so he stayed on the Pacific Northwest expedition, I believe, for
Hmm.
about 2 years. He talked to me a lot about that.
Well, Dustin, I got another question for you.
Mm.
Now, I mentioned before, I kind of like how you did the dialogue and everything, but I know we weren't there. So how in the world did you come up with this dialogue?
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, I had to take some liberties. So I kind of pay homage to the originator of this style of writing, which is Truman Capote in his book In Cold Blood. So he called it a nonfiction novel. Essentially, it's a classic nonfiction, but you intersperse it with dialogue, scenes, kind of the literary equivalent to a docudrama. So you just kind of so I say 80% of my book is just classic informational nonfiction, but I do throw in some scenes with dialogue, and I took great pains to be as accurate as possible. Of course, you have to take some liberties, uh, but yeah, I try to stay true to the characters. To give you one example, there's one chapter in the book called got here just so I don't forget, called The High Priest of Nature Fakers, which kind of introduces the readers to Ivan Sanderson. There's a scene where they're driving on Highway 101 with his two associates. This is all true.
In the
The
station wagon.
dates, yeah, in a station wagon, absolutely true. The dates are all correct. Everything's true about it. And I just have a dialogue conversation between them. And how I did it is I made a collection of quotes from Ivan Sanders through all his interviews and all his books, and I just kind of made a dialogue back and forth. So I wanted, like I said, I don't want it to be an analytical book. However, I knew at some point I had to talk about the whole does Bigfoot exist or Bigfoot does not exist, or at that time, could an abominable snowman exist in California? So I just had it as an argument between Ivan Sanders and his associate. His name was Robert Christie, which was a real person. So yeah, so that's kind of that's how I formatted a lot of the dialogue scenes. There's actually stuff that these individuals actually said. For example, in the first chapter, Jerry Crew's inner monologue, he said, if these things exist, referring to Bigfoot, Noah must have had them on the ark. There's actually a newspaper article where he actually said that. So I was like, I wasn't for sure if I wanted to put that in the book because I thought it sounded kind of cheesy, but maybe that's why I
Yeah.
feel compelled to say he actually did say it. So yeah, I took tremendous pains to be as accurate as possible to portray these guys.
Yeah, and I like the way you talked about the little bit of history on the guy who was in charge of the newspaper at the time in Eureka.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't
Yeah.
realize he was such a prominent person. I'll let you share the names.
Yeah. So his name is Andrew Gonzoli. So he's the guy larger credited with coining the name Bigfoot. So I discussed there were some precursors to the usage before that, but as largely recognized in American popular culture today, the name Bigfoot was coined by Andrew Gonzoli on October 5th, 1958. So he's a regional editor for the Humboldt Times there in Eureka. So at the time, there was two local newspapers there. There was the Humboldt Times and the Humboldt Standard, and he worked for the Humboldt Times. He had a daily column called RFD, which is for Rural Free Delivery. And so a young woman named Corley Bemis brought him in, sent him a letter, asked him a question because he was considered like the history savant. People would just send random questions, ask him, get commentary from him. And that's when she mentioned her husband was a cat scanner up in, his name was Jess Bemis. And she wrote him a letter and she said, "Hey, have you ever heard of this, of a wild man living up near Bluff Creek?" And that's how it all started.
And the other character I was fascinated with, the history of Betty Allen. I think I said that right, didn't I?
Betty Allen all her parts were really good. I had no idea who she even was until I learned of her in this book.
Yeah, she's definitely been overlooked in Bigfoot history. She played a really prominent role. I was fortunate enough to interview her daughter, who gave me a lot of that information in the book. So, and then there's some other newspaper articles. Her obituary has a lot of historical information too. But yeah, I really want to bring her to light because I really don't think she's received the credit over the last 70 years as she deserved.
What was that controversy you were talking about before? You and Daniel Perez are always going at it about.
Yes. So there's I'm still a little bit obsessed with it, and I haven't completely thrown in the towel yet. So for my second book, we're trying to figure out who wrote. So obviously the Patterson Gimlin film was allegedly shot on October 20th, 1967. So that night they called the Eureka Times standards. Oddly enough, so I had mentioned back in the 50s is the Humboldt Standard and the Humboldt Times, and of all times they actually merged in the fall of 1967. So the time they became the Eureka Times Standard. So that night, apparently from the ranger station where Sil McCoy headed up the Six Rivers, whatever their station there outside of Willow Creek, Roger Patterson called the newspaper and relayed the story. It was on the front page the next morning, October 21st. The headline was "Mrs. Bigfoot is filmed," which introduced the Patterson Gimlin film to the world. However, there's no byline given to the author. And amazing, it's been almost 60 years now. We still don't know who wrote that. So a lot of people assumed it was Betty Allen, but Betty Allen actually, she had moved to Alaska in 1965, which doesn't necessarily mean it's impossible, but extremely unlikely that Betty Allen wrote that. Actually, somebody asked Bob Gimlin in 2003 who wrote it, and he said Betty Allen, but I think somebody just fed that to him. He had no clue who Betty Allen was. So anyway, to make a long story short, me and Daniel have been trying to figure out who it is, and both have some candidates. The particular person he thinks it is, it's possible it could be him, but I think it's unlikely. And I have a candidate too, but I can't prove it. I've been able to track down 3 members of the editorial staff, and I was able to interview them over the phone. All 3 of them said they don't know who wrote it. About getting closer, slowly but surely.
No, I think I texted you and asked you about that. I was like, is there a way to kind of look at their editing or writing styles and kind of determine, even though it was like probably printed, is there ways to determine that?
Yeah, so there's an article written when the Blue Creek Mountain thing occurred. So there was an article written in August of 1967 which talks about John Green bringing a white lady, the German Shepherd they brought, and whoever wrote that, and this article, I can't remember the title, also was not given a byline, but the language is identical to Mrs. Bigfoot was filmed. So whoever wrote that article certainly wrote that one as well. So the interesting thing is why they would not be given a byline. If you're a paid employee, you're on the editorial staff of the newspaper, why would you write a front page article and not be given credit for it. So I actually posed this question to the people I interviewed, and they said that perhaps the person was embarrassed that they wanted their name associated with it. The last woman I spoke to, I don't know if I want to give her a name, but she was a very young woman. Obviously, they had to be young to still be alive today. And she said something interesting. She goes, "Well, it was the fall. It was the fall season. On Friday night, the sports writer, whoever the sports writer would have been there that night." And oddly enough, the person who Daniel Perez believes it is was a sports writer, but it gets more complicated than that. I won't get into it, but yeah,
that's a conversation for another time.
Oh no. I
thought it was an interesting point because I asked her, I go, I assume because you're like 20 years old, you probably got shafted with having to work the phones on a Friday night. She's like, no, it would have been the sports writers would have been there on a Friday night. So that makes a lot of sense. So I know who the sports writer was at that time, and actually she was married to the guy. So now I'm currently trying to track him down, but he has an extremely common name. So I haven't been successful at tracking him down.
And he's still alive, right? How old?
I don't know. He's the same age as her. She's like in her late 70s, so he'd be in his late 70s. So he certainly could still be alive. But they divorced like I think in the early 70s, so she's lost contact with him. She hasn't spoken to him in decades, so she wasn't able to tell me any information on how to track him down. But once I talk to him, if I do get him on the phone, he shrugs his shoulder, then I'm gonna throw in the towel officially.
Now you know what the Bluff Creek Project does.
People. Go ahead, man.
Oh, I'm sorry. Now you know what the Bluff Creek Project does for entertainment, debate, news articles, and who does what and what does who. And
that's all. That's all it is in the private chat, or it's like it's that, or it's either like a bidding war between like Jamie and Steven on eBay.
Buying books.
We could learn a lot. I mean, if we were to track this person down, we could learn a lot of information because it is a little suspicious that he apparently called cold on a Friday night, and it's a pretty extensive article. It seemed like it would have taken some time to write. So I'd also pose this question to some of the editorial staff. I was able to get on the phone. And I was like, how much time? What time would they publish it? I don't. There's a lot of questions I don't have answers to, but of course, there's always been that conspiracy that perhaps Patterson was collaborating with somebody at the Times Standard, but I think it's likely that he was with Al Hodgson at the time, who was kind of a pillar of the community and knew everybody. So I'm assuming that he would have linked Patterson up with somebody. I should also point out that Patterson's had been to Bluff Creek multiple times over the previous few years, so he inevitably made some contacts while he was there.
Was that Andrew Gonzoli guy? Did he ever go to the film site after or not? Or did he ever kind of
go to Bluff Creek? Yeah,
he did go to Bluff Creek.
Yeah, in '58 he ended up going up there.
Did he go with? Oh God, why am I?
I can't recall who brought him up there. So Betty Allen went there on October 2nd. That was her maiden voyage. I'd probably write about that.
And that's the ghostwriter, you think, right? Or no?
No. I don't believe it was Betty Allen. But so Betty Allen's maiden voyage was October 2nd. That was the same day, and she actually went up there to see Jerry Krupp, the cast. They ended up being on the front page 3 days later.
Okay. I get
she saw a lot of footprints. Like she was always all up in the mix, publishing her articles. She was a pretty interesting person.
Yeah, she was a really sweet lady.
I got two more characters to throw in the mix here.
Yeah,
one of them I read about before in Coleman's work, but Jimmy Stewart and Tom Slick.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you want to chat a little bit about those two characters for us?
Yeah, so I write about the famous smuggling operation that went down in 1959. So it's kind of a yarn that's kind of went through some various permutations over the last few decades by the late Mr. Peter Byrne. But yeah, apparently the story is in 1959 he smuggled a thumb from the Pangboche, I believe that's how you pronounce it, monastery and got it back into England to put under the microscope. So I added that interesting little episode. Well, the interesting thing is that the smuggling operation or getting it back into England was done by Jimmy Stewart and his wife. For you youngsters who don't know who Jimmy Stewart is,
isn't he wasn't an actor, was he? Or
he was an actor.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yep.
It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah. He's probably one of the most famous people in the world at that time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think
he's in all the Hitchcock movies, a lot of the Hitchcock movies, Vertigo, and
they snuck it in his Jimmy Stewart's fiance's or wife's.
Was it like
the stories never made sense to me? But I mean, was it really be that hard to smuggle? I mean, even in today's TSA environment, I feel like I could smuggle a finger through. I don't know why they made out like such a difficult thing to do. That never made sense to me.
They had to go all Mission Impossible and like make a fake mask.
I don't think there was any security. Almost. I mean, perhaps since it was an international flight and it was in the Cold War, I suppose. But yeah, I believe as was the penchant for Peter Byrne, I believe he embellished the story a tad, but it's still a classic.
Hey, Dustin, funny. I mean, if you want to talk to Peter Byrne still today, I mean,
Ouija board,
Jonathan. No, well, that's one way. Jonathan, I think
I did communicate with Peter Byrne a little bit by email, but he was just, I didn't want to talk to him because he's 97 years old. You should
talk to him right now, Jonathan. I think you can.
I know what Tate's getting at. No, Tate likes my Peter Byrne impression that I bust out around camp all the time.
You should let Dustin
Severs. I've read your book. It's very good. It's very good.
Yeah, he's weird because him and Sanderson are the same. Byrne was Irish, but he had an English accent, and Sanderson was Scottish and had an English accent. I mean, it made sense. Peter Byrne's mom was English. That's why he had an English accent. But he didn't have a trace of an Irish accent. The same with Ivan Sanderson, not a trace of a Scottish accent.
Yeah,
these are 100% English accent.
So weird. Weird.
It's just so cool that like these. That's what I keep talking about. These larger than life characters, like Peter Byrne, like that dude's insane. You can make an entire movie about that guy, you know.
Yes.
And it's like it. I tell people about Peter Byrne, and like they question, like, did he really do all that stuff? Are you being serious? Like, no, he was like this crazy adventurer. Such an awesome person, and it's so cool that
he preceded him.
He was up here in Willow Creek.
He was doing Yeti hunts. He was doing, minor Yeti expeditions in the 1940s, even before the Eric Shifton track from 1951. I mean, he preceded all of them, so he goes back farther than anybody. It's amazing. He was still alive just a few months ago.